Wow. Just wow, man. I have just gotten home from watching Spider-Man No Way Home, and I need to Venmo my friend for the ticket. So I guess you will hear me doing that, but I just had to come home and talk about this because many people knew this movie was going to be this movie was going to be big. And going into it, we've all seen the leaks and, stuff like that, whether or not you knew they were true. Whether or not you knew it was true remains to be seen, but I'll Venmo my friend after this is over. But whether or not the leaks were true, I'm going to be talking about it in this video. Before I get to anything, I just want to say that this video is going to contain monumental spoilers. And by monumental, I mean literally every spoiler on the planet for every movie ever is going to be in this video. So, this video is intended for people who have seen the movie and just want to see other people's reactions to said movie. So if you haven't seen the movie, you probably should be diagnosed as clinically insane. Either buy a movie ticket or not, and probably click off the video. And if you have seen the movie, then do whatever you fair share, or do whatever you may choose if you want to click off the video. But there are a lot of things I want to talk about, and I don't really have a set script or order. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump around from stuff to stuff as I remember it. But number one, this is the third movie in the MCU Spider-Man trilogy. And it will not be the last, as there is another Spider-Man MCU trilogy already confirmed with Tom Holland returning as Spider-Man. So we will get more, and as I'll talk about the ending that actually really well sets up the story to expand upon in further MCU Spider-Man trilogies. But we're going to begin with the first big leak, and that is the fact that Matt Murdock is in the movie. And Charlie Cox does reprise his role as Matt Murdock. So, what does that mean? Number one, it was a cameo. He did not have a big role in the movie whatsoever. He was in the movie for literally the beginning, and then he has one scene actually, and then he never shows up again. I personally like this as a cameo. I think if Matt Murdock participated in any way, shape, or form as Daredevil in this movie, it would have taken away from the plot. This is a Spider-Man story. It's about Spider-Man, his family, friends, and villains. And Matt Murdock just doesn't make sense when he's been introduced as a character. As a character who they just met, today. Or, not today, but in this movie. Especially seeing him fight with all the Spider-Man would have been weird. But anyway, his cameo was fine. Charlie Cox, of course, was reprising his role as Matthew Murdock. And to be honest, Charlie Cox as Daredevil is one of the best castings Marvel's ever done. I think he does absolutely tremendous as the character of Matt Murdock. Same with Vincent D'Onofrio as the Kingpin. The Daredevil series on Netflix is very underrated. Season 1 and Season 3 are absolutely great. Season 2 is a bit mid. But pretty much, if the Kingpin's the villain, you got yourself a good season. Season 2 focused a bit more on Elektra, and then, of course, the Defenders is great when Daredevil's on screen. And then Daredevil talks about him being a lawyer, and then he catches a brick. Spider-Man asks, how did you do that? And of course, he says he's a really good lawyer, thus confirming that he is already actively Daredevil. So this does confirm that Daredevil is in the MCU, whether or not he is a variant or any of the jazz like that. If the Netflix show is canon or not, I don't know. I really hope it is, just because I don't know. if they make a Daredevil series for Disney Plus or anything, I don't want all the previous story to be undermined that they've already done. I want this Daredevil to have gone through the events of stuff like Season 3 and The Defenders, and stuff like that, but we'll see. Anyway, I'm talking too much about Daredevil. I like the Daredevil show a lot. It made me like him as a character, but that's just the first leak that I want to talk about and get out of the way. Pretty much the movie starts with what we thought it would: Mysterio leaking Spider-Man's identity, picks up right where it left off. J.K. Simmons does return as J. Jonah Jameson in this movie. He has a bit of a decent role, nothing too major, nothing too big. And we get a nice scene of Peter being public enemy number 1. He gets all of the charges dropped on him thanks to Matt Murdock. And but the main source of conflict is that everyone knows who Peter is that he's Spider-Man. And he ends up trying to get into college with his 2 friends, right, Ned and MJ. And I don't know. I really like this as the whole catalyst because Peter and MJ and Ned want to get into MIT. And of course, MIT is a very prestigious school, and they all want to be together and live together as friends. And them getting rejected because of recent controversy surrounding Peter is, I think, a very realistic take on how stuff like that can really affect you in a world which is very supernatural, with superheroes and wizards and aliens and shit. So that's all that stuff's flying. Next, once Peter and MJ get rejected for college, that's what fuels Peter to go to Doctor Strange and ask him to cast the spell. Now, reluctantly, Strange does it, and he does it thinking Peter wants everyone to forget that he's Spider-Man, meaning that everyone, meaning even Doctor Strange himself. And obviously Peter wants to throw in all these exceptions like MJ and Ned and Aunt May and Happy, and a lot of exceptions, which ends up casting the spell that Doctor Strange wants to make it makes it go a bit awry, obviously, right? And that's when you get all the multiversal visitors. People start slipping through the cracks. So the spell Doctor Strange ends up containing it. He shoves Peter out the door because Peter didn't call or plead his case with MIT. So then Peter goes to, talk to the MIT chick or whatever. And, that's when we get to meet Dr. Octopus, and they have the whole fight and shit. The bridge scene is great because the Doc Ock fight is pretty perfect. We get to see Doc Ock, one of the most iconic Spider-Man villains, back in action. Of course, Alfred Molina portraying Doc Ock. And I'll talk more about Doc Ock here in a second. But, they have a fight. Doc Ock talks about his machine. He finds out that Peter Parker isn't Spider-Man, or, this Peter Parker isn't his Peter Parker. And then Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin comes out. Of course, in the classic suit. Now, it's at this point where Peter basically is given the mission by Doctor Strange that he needs to go collect all the other multiversal people who escaped and slipped through the cracks, like Lizard, who we see already caught, Doc Ock, Green Goblin, Electro, and Sandman. Then there's a lot of stuff that happens, but Peter saves the MIT chick, and she's going to reconsider. But I want to talk about Doc Ock here, because initially the plot, I saw a lot of people saying whether or not Doc Ock was going to be controlled by his tentacles or not. And he was controlled by his tentacles. He does absorb the nanotechnology from Peter's suit into his tentacles. So that was pretty sick. And then we'll see later on that he gives the nanotech back to Peter for the final fight, but we'll talk about that later. And of course Doc Ock is caught, and he's initially a bad guy because, he definitely isn't as bad as the other villains, but very interesting dynamic is what this movie takes. And that's that this movie focuses on Peter finds out that all of the villains die fighting Spider-Man. Lizard dies, Andrew Garfield, Electro gets blown up, Doc Ock is drowned. He ends up drowning his own machine. Green Goblin ends up puncturing himself with his own glider. Sandman dies somehow. Not exactly sure how that's mentioned, but he dies somehow. And so on and so on. And that is what brings up when we see Norman Osborn still being controlled by his alternate personality of Green Goblin. Now, Norman Osborn ends up going to Feast, which is somewhere that we saw in Insomniac Games of Spider-Man. It's the homeless shelter that Aunt May runs. He ends up going there and asking for help because Aunt May thinks he is sick and in need of help. And obviously, the Green Goblin has a classic case of split personality disorder. And he also has superpowers with it, so that's what goes with it. But I want to talk about this movie does a very interesting dynamic because it takes a theme that many movies try to do, and that's, can you change your fate? Are you inevitably going to end up wherever fate takes you? For example, Strange mentions how in the multiversal, in the big scale of the multiverse, you can only, you have to make self-sacrifices for the timelines to work. For example, all those villains have to die fighting Spider-Man, and normal movies would either say, yes, you can change your fate. Some darker movies would say, no, you can't change your fate. Maybe have the villain and the hero be direct light and dark reflections of that. But what this movie does is it really gives a new take on that because, for example, Peter ends up fighting Doctor Strange. So we get a hero v hero fight because Peter's Aunt May tells him that his morality, he needs morals, he needs to help these people. It's his duty. He's been given a gift and he needs to help people. So he ends up breaking out all the villains in an attempt to help them. So when they go back to their universe, they don't die. And initially this works because Norman Osborn is being cool and he's doing all the scientist shit. Electro agrees, the Lizard agrees, and blah, 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 bibbly blue blue. And Aunt May ends up, keeping his morality. And then we see a really cool thing in that he actually does help cure one of the villains. And that is Doc Ock. So Doc Ock initially starts off as a bad guy, but then we see that they talk about how the inhibitor chip on his back or whatever is supposed to keep the tentacles from controlling him, and they make a new one, they put it in, and Doc Ock is now, he even has a cool scene where he talks about how the voices are finally gone. And I didn't mention this, but I might as well touch on it now, how all the original actors are here to reprise their roles. Jamie Foxx returns as Electro. I believe his name is Riz Ahmed. No, that's not Riz Ahmed, it's the dude from the fucking Venom. The guy who plays the Lizard. Sorry, I don't remember his name. Thomas Hayden Church comes back as Sandman. And then, of course, Alfred Molina and Willem Dafoe reprise their roles as Green Goblin and Doc Ock. Probably the two best characters in this movie, for me personally. I just love Doc Ock and Green Goblin. They're probably two of the best comic book villains ever written. And I think their roles in this movie are really very, very well designed. So, Doc Ock is now cured, right? He feels great. He thanks Peter for helping him, and from this point on, he is now a good guy in this movie. And you're going to say, oh, spoilers, but I already warned you, so shut up. It's at this point that it is revealed that the Green Goblin was playing Spider-Man all along, and that the villains end up ransacking the entire rest of the world because, they don't want to die or go back to their world. And the Green Goblin and Spider-Man have a crazy fight where, they're both just hacking at each other. And, they don't know karate or anything. They're not martial artists. The Green Goblin has super strength and probably agility and stuff like that. Your typical superpower shit. So does Spider-Man, but he has webs instead. And they're just going at it. And it's really cool how Willem Dafoe, he agreed to come back if he could do his own stunts and the action, which he likes doing. And he's a 65-year-old man. Props to him, because he did his own stunts and choreographs, and he was amazing in this movie. Willem Dafoe as the main villain of the Green Goblin absolutely kills it. Because in a movie where there's 5 villains from previous movies, you'd think they would try to create a Sinister Six type vibe, but in the end, it's the Green Goblin that really ends up taking the cake as the man that Peter really ends up, getting that arch nemesis type vibe. And what ends up happening is the Green Goblin beats the shit out of Peter and ends up telling him that his morality is his weakness, and that, the only way, to be strong in this world without morals, blah, blah, your typical villain shit. I will say, while the villains are not tragic in this movie, it's not like you're like, oh no, they're, I don't agree with the villains. They're all iconic characters that are played well enough to where the Green Goblin can carry the main villain load because of the charisma that Willem Dafoe has, the iconic nature behind the Green Goblin, and his previous appearance in the Spider-Man movies. And of all that, right? We don't need tragic fucking villains. And in the end, this is another big spoiler, the Green Goblin ends up killing Aunt May. And she gives him the line, with great power comes great responsibility. And I will say there are a ton of callbacks in this movie. Like, for example, Norman Osborn saying, I'm something of a scientist myself. With great power comes great responsibility line. And we'll get to the main dynamic later. But Doc Ock says, the power of the sun in the palm of my hand. So many callbacks in this movie. And with so here's the big thing, right? I saw a report that I saw a report that a major character was going to die in Spider-Man No Way Home. And to be quite honest, it made sense. All the marketing and the interviews were saying that this movie was going to be way darker than any other MCU movie before it. And while it wasn't super, super dark in terms of like Logan and, movies like that, definitely one of the darker Spider-Man movies, I'd say. Because Spider-Man does get beaten down in this movie. He doesn't have a lot of allies during the middle of the movie. He needs to protect his friends who don't have superpowers. A lot of shit going down in this movie. And Aunt May, to me, seemed the most logical when killing someone off, because Happy wouldn't have made much sense. Because he's not, I don't know, it doesn't have the emotional punch. MJ or Ned wouldn't make much sense due to the ending that we see. But Aunt May, to me, makes more sense because she's been Peter's mentor, his guardian. The emotional to plot relevance was just too good. It made too much sense. So Aunt May ends up kicking the bucket. And now we really start hating Green Goblin. And this is when Spider-Man really hits his low. And this is where we get the big reveal of when Ned tries to open up a portal to find Peter using Doctor Strange's ring, because remember, Peter traps Doctor Strange in the mirror dimension. We get the big reveal that Andrew Garfield and Toby Maguire are in the movie. Yes, folks, they're in the movie, and they had to hide a lot of stuff. R.I.P. Andrew Garfield, because he had to lie through his teeth to get people to stop asking him about this movie. And to be quite honest, their dynamics in this movie were incredible. Because Andrew Garfield comes in, and we didn't, I don't know, I expected a huge reveal for the three of them. But to be quite honest, their reveal was pretty good. Ned opens a portal trying to look for Peter, and he ends up getting Andrew Garfield instead. Andrew Garfield jumps to the portal, takes off his mask, and people in the theater went crazy. People in the theater went bananas for Andrew Garfield. And here's the thing. One thing this movie did well is I am not a fan of the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man movies. I think those movies are very bad. Andrew Garfield's a good actor, and I don't think it was his fault. His character writing for Spider-Man was very shitty. But this movie really made me like Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man. Because throughout all these times when him and Toby and Tom are interacting, He just has a lot of really good, witty lines. He has a lot of witty dialogue in here against the villains, and that's what Spider-Man is. A key aspect of Spider-Man is he talks a lot of shit. And I think they really nailed it with Andrew Garfield's portrayal of Spider-Man in this movie, as he's the shit talker. He talks a ton of shit to the villains. He has a ton of jokes. He's the funny guy. All right, he is the funny guy. And he's a good actor, and we'll get to him later. But then guess what? Toby shows up. Toby shows up when they try to summon him, and he's the seasoned vet. All right, they totally play into him being much older. It's implied that Andrew Garfield's much older than his movies, but it's definitely very, very common knowledge that when Toby in the movie is many, many years older than when we last saw him in Spider-Man 3, and a lot. He's gone through a lot with Norman, Otto, and Harry, Venom, and Sandman in Spider-Man 3 with MJ as well. They both, Toby and Andrew, play off well together in the scene. They go and they find Tom Holland, and he's pretty dead inside after the loss of Aunt May. And they explain to him that they know what he's going through, as Toby mentions the "with great power comes great responsibility" line from his Uncle Ben, who died, and then Andrew mentions how Gwen died. And this scene, I think, is very powerful. They do not take this line in any way, shape, or form. I don't think they overuse it. I think they use it correctly to where it keeps its power, but when you hear it, you kind of get it. You know how, like, in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, he mentions how every single Spider-Man kind of has a formula, how they've all lost someone, that's what's pushed them to do all the good that they're doing. Well, this is the same here. Andrew, Toby, and Tom have all lost someone in their lives that pushes them forward. Now it's May, because we've never seen Tom Holland lose anyone besides Tony, who was, he was a father to him, but that wasn't a Spider-Man movie. We haven't seen Uncle Ben, so losing May made sense for Tom Holland's character here, and we've lost Gwen, and Toby's lost Ben. I'm just going to skip to the final battle here because this video is dragging on. But there are a lot of huge character moments that a lot of people wanted if Toby, Andrew, and Tom were all together. For example, they all mention how Toby can shoot webs out of his wrists. Have a good few witty conversations there. Tom mentions how he fought, an alien with Infinity Stones, and Toby mentions how he fought an alien made out of black goo, and then Andrew's like, I want to fight some aliens. And, they all have some witty banter. Ned says, oh, hey, Peter, and all three of them answer. It's really quite good scenes here, just funny dialogue. It was interesting because they said this movie was going to be quite dark, but I feel like the MCU comedy was dialed back a bit, but not as much as I expected. Doctor Strange's role in this movie is also pretty solid. He kind of serves as a secondary antagonist to Peter's, what's what I'm looking for? To his philosophy. Doctor Strange is trying to do whatever it takes to save the multiverse, whereas Peter believes in giving these villains a second chance. And that's what the Spider-Men agree with as well, so they all end up working to give these villains a second chance. And that's the final battle, is all three Spider-Men on the Statue of Liberty, giving all of the villains a second chance, because Doc Ock shows up. He kind of tricks you into thinking he's a villain, and then he rips the arc reactor off of Electro. They put a little thing on Electro that kind of takes all the electricity out of his body, so he's now a normal guy. Andrew has a nice convo with him, and he's redeemed. Sandman is cured. He's redeemed. The Lizard is cured, and I'm assuming he's redeemed. And then we get the final battle of when MJ and Ned fall off the Eiffel Tower, the Statue of Liberty, because they're trying to protect the box. The Green Goblin ends up shattering the box, and Doctor Strange has to contain the spell. And then Andrew Garfield ends up saving MJ the same way Gwen died, and we get a really good moment where he saves her. Everyone in the crowd, everyone in the theater started really feeling for Andrew here, because he starts bawling. because obviously this is the thing he could not do with Gwen. Finally, we get the final battle, 1v1 against Green Goblin. Greenie ends up, Tom Holland rightfully beats the shit out of him, and right before he's about to kill Green Goblin, Toby stops him. And then, Toby gets stabbed by the Green Goblin. I fully expected Toby Maguire to die in this movie, but he didn't. He didn't. And we then get a scene of when they inject Norman with the anti-cure, whatever the fuck it is, the anti-serum or something. Norman's cured. They cure all the villains in this movie. So, the whole everyone deserves a second chance thing? They do it. Even though Peter's philosophy is really tested, because Aunt May took that philosophy to her grave with helping Norman and then dying for it, Peter gets the other 3 Spider-Men to inspire him to stick with it, and he ends up convincing Strange, and he cures all of the villains of their ailments. He redeems all 5 villains, and then Strange sends them back to their respective universes. Toby gets stabbed, but he survives and he makes it. And then, of course, Peter has a really good moment with all the 3 Spider-Men. Strange sends them back. We end the movie on Peter deciding to make a huge decision to have Strange cast a spell where everyone will forget that who Peter Parker is. So MJ and Ned will forget, Doctor Strange himself will forget, and that will send everyone back home. And that's what he ends up doing. All the villains go home. Hallelujah, happy day. The Spider-Mans go home, and we end with Peter finally giving, the victory kiss with MJ right before she forgets who he is completely. And then he's going to tell her at the end of the movie, but he decides not to tell her when he finds out that her and Ned got into MIT. And the movie ends with Tom Holland, Spider-Man, renting an apartment and swinging around as Spider-Man in his new suit that is much more comic accurate. And then pretty much what I think here is I really like the decision of having everyone forget who Peter Parker is, because it gives him kind of a fresh start. He now has a clean slate for those next trilogies of Spider-Man movies, that Tom Holland is going to star in. There's now a clean slate. No one knows who he is. He can start over. It's going to give a new, fresh take on Spider-Man that we can see in the future. And then there's 2 post-credit scenes. The second one is just a trailer for Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. But the first one is Tom Hardy's Venom. Tom Hardy's Venom was one of the people who was sucked in to the multiverse or whatever, and he arrived in the MCU, but how do I say this? He didn't fuck shit up like the villains did, so no one really knew about him, and he was whisked back when Strange did the spell. And when he was whisked back, we see he left a little bit of symbiote goo on the table. So it sets up the symbiote storyline in the MCU, which is a big thing. Definitely a big thing. To be quite honest, this movie was absolutely fan-fucking-tastic. Peter's decision here to grow as a character and kind of accept that everyone needs to forget in order to, do the right thing, I think was great. I think they, them redeeming every single villain was definitely a good. I liked it a lot. Aunt May died. I expected Toby Maguire to die, but he didn't, which is, fine by me. I think Doc Ock's character was great. Green Goblin served as a huge antagonist. There was there was a big final battle at the end, but it wasn't like Endgame style, but it had a ton of emotional conflict when it was finally 1v1 against the Green Goblin. And of course, Willem Dafoe, Alfred Molina, Jamie Foxx, Toby, Andrew, Tom, Zendaya, Jacob, it was all just good directing. Benedict Cumberbatch as well. And then the cliffhanger at the end. Just, this movie was so good on all levels. Charlie Cox in the beginning. This movie had so much going for it. It was so damn good, man. definitely worth the $15 that I had to pay to get in. Absolutely banging movie. I'm not going to give it a rating or anything because I'm not a critic, but one of the best MCU movies, hands down, the best out of the Spider-Man trilogy. And to be quite honest, I don't know how they're going to top this movie going into the next Spider-Man trilogy, but at this point, I'm excited for whatever they have up their sleeves because, my God, this movie was just fucking fantastic, man. I mean, that's all I got to say, bro. I'm done at this point.